Hello there, friend, and welcome, wherever you are, nestled beneath warm covers, resting on a quiet porch, or letting the hush of night surround you. I'm glad you found your way here. This is a place of soft shadows and forgotten echoes, where history is told not with blaring horns or bright lights, but with a whisper. If you haven't already, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan, something soft and steady in the background. Let your mind slow. Let your breath settle. And if you feel like it, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is, and whether you're drifting into sleep or simply seeking a quieter corner of the world. Either way, I'm here to guide you there. And if these journeys bring you peace, I'd be honored if you subscribed. So you'll never miss the next story whispered just for you. Now, close your eyes if you like, because we're about to step into the golden light of a time long gone. The sun rises over the Nile, and it rises slowly, deliberately. Its warmth brushes against the sands like a breath from the gods, glinting off the reeds and the still water. In the hush of dawn, a rhythm pulses across the land, slow paddles in the current, the soft thud of sandals on dry earth, the rustle of linen robes and swaying grain. And there, on the horizon, pyramids, vast and unmoving, casting shadows that have touched every life that walked these lands. This is Egypt, not the postcard Egypt, not the museum artifact, but the living, breathing one, the Egypt of pain, of labor, of birth and blood and death. A world where stone and sweat mingled for thousands of years, and beneath its glory, a quiet suffering endured, almost always invisible. Because this isn't a tale about pharaohs or gods. Tonight we follow someone else. She was born not far from the river's edge. Not a queen, not a name etched in stone, just a girl. Her cries, high and thin, were swallowed by the wind, ignored by scribes, unnoticed by men. Her mother held her close, whispered a prayer, not for greatness, not for wealth, but simply for survival, that she might live long enough to carry water without falling, that she might one day give birth and not die screaming. From the very first breath, her world was defined by absence, of choice, of power, of voice. When she was old enough to understand speech, she learned her first lesson quickly. Do not be seen. Be still. Be small. Obedient. When she misstepped, the correction came not as explanation, but as a slap. And so she watched her mother bow to her father. She watched her brothers eat first, speak first, leave first. Her eyes adjusted to the shadows where she waited. She was told she was lucky. After all, Egyptian women had more rights than many others. She could own property. She could inherit a goat or a patch of land. In theory, she could divorce her husband, could run a business. In theory. But theory doesn't feed the baby when your husband is dead, and your son is too young to be your guardian. Theory doesn't protect you from the hand that strikes you behind closed doors. Theory doesn't erase the fact that you cannot write your own name, that the temple school would never take you, that you will never become a scribe, never read the prayers you mouth. Instead, she learned to grind grain until her shoulders ached. She memorized the sound of boiling water, the feel of fish bones beneath her fingers, the way to mix honey and resin to ease a fever. She learned the rhythm of menstruation and the fear of missing it. She learned that to be chosen as a wife was not love, it was survival. On her wedding night, she did not speak. Her eyes were dry. Her heart a quiet drumbeat beneath the pressure of duty. She did not know the man who lay beside her. She only knew that from now on, her body was his, and that her value now lay in how many children she could bear. The first time she bled too much, a midwife muttered a spell under her breath and pressed linen against her thighs. The child did not live, nor did the second. The third came with screaming, a tearing so deep she could not walk for days. But he breathed, and so she smiled through cracked lips and told the gods she was grateful. They say 1 in 3 women died giving life, but no one counted the ones who didn't die but never returned, the ones whose bodies collapsed inward, whose minds shattered from pain and grief and silence. She lived for now, but each sunrise grew heavier. Her husband fell ill during a bad flood year. The water rose too high and the grain rotted in the storerooms. By midsummer, he was gone. Her son, 6 years old, was too young to inherit. And she, no longer wife, but widow, became nothing. She begged the temple for work. They took her in, not as priestess, of course, but as a cleaner. She swept the halls that men prayed in. She washed linens embroidered with gods she couldn't speak to. She stared at statues whose mouths were open in stone song, asking why they never answered her. Each day her body broke a little more. Her fingers bent from years of grinding grain. Her back curved from carrying water pots. Her knees darkened from kneeling before others. And yet she lived, quietly, invisibly. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, no statue was carved, no tomb painted, just a shallow grave and a whispered prayer. But she had been real, and she had endured. So when we speak of ancient Egypt, of pyramids and gold, of pharaohs and gods, we must also remember her. Not because she ruled, but because she bore the weight of the world and was never thanked. And perhaps tonight we can thank her. But not all women in ancient Egypt were faceless, nameless, or forgotten. Sometimes, very rarely, a woman's shadow stretched across the sun, and one such shadow belonged to her. Nefertiti. You've seen her face before, though you may not have known her story. A bust of limestone and stucco, impossibly elegant, her features carved with such precision it seems she might blink if the wind stirred too hard. Regal, poised, a beauty for the ages. But stone lies, or at least it hides. Behind that gaze was a mind trained to move like the Nile, calm on the surface, powerful beneath. Before she became queen, she was merely a noble's daughter. Her bloodline was respectable, yes, but not royal. Her future should have been like so many others: marriage, motherhood, obscurity. But the gods, it seems, had other plans. She married a man named Akhenaten, a name that would come to mean upheaval, madness, heresy. Together they would shatter Egypt's sacred foundations, and she, the queen, would stand at the epicenter of a revolution few truly understood. Akhenaten was unlike other pharaohs. He turned away from the crowded pantheon of gods worshipped for centuries: the jackal-headed Anubis, the falcon of Horus, the throne of Isis, and raised instead a single blinding deity above all, Aten, the sun disk, a god without a face, a god without temples, without form, just light. And in that light, Nefertiti did not hide. She ruled, not quietly, not from the shadows, but in public beside her husband wearing the blue crown, traditionally reserved for kings, carrying out rituals, making offerings, issuing decrees. Sculptures show her smiting enemies, riding in chariots, acting not as consort, but as co-ruler. And yet, we know so little of her. Her name, once carved beside his, suddenly vanishes in the records. Her face disappears from walls, as if swallowed by the very light she once worshipped. Some say she died. Others whisper that she changed her name, became Pharaoh herself under another identity. And others still believe she was erased, silenced. But why? Was it fear, jealousy? Was it politics? Or perhaps the world could only bear so much of a woman in power before it turned away. Whatever the reason, what remains is not a full life, but fragments. A statue here, a name chiseled out there, a story half told, buried beneath sand and silence. But imagine with me, just for a moment, she stands atop a sandstone balcony, overlooking the strange, unfinished city her husband built in the desert, Akhenaten. The horizon burns with the last orange glow of day, and the wind carries the scent of dry stone and fading papyrus. Below her, the city stirs with low voices and the rustle of robes. Above her, a 10 sets. She closes her eyes. Does she feel triumphant or trapped? Does she miss the old gods, the ones with wings and teeth and stories that made sense? Does she wonder if she was ever truly queen, or only ever a vessel for someone else's dream? And when the scribes stop writing her name, when the priests stop whispering her titles, does she know she's already being forgotten? It's a strange thing, to live a life loud enough to shake a kingdom, and still fade from memory like dust blown from stone. But such was the way of Egypt. Even the powerful were fragile. Even queens could vanish. Still, The bust remains. In a Berlin museum, under controlled light and careful glass, she waits, not for recognition, not even for justice, just for a single moment of remembrance. And tonight we give it to her. She was more than her face, she was power made flesh. And whether she was loved or feared or buried beneath myth, she was. And that is enough. Beyond the palaces and alabaster columns, far from the sunlit courts where queens like Nefertiti dared to speak in the tongues of kings, another kind of life whispered in the shadows. Not every woman in ancient Egypt wore gold or had her name etched into limestone. Most wore linen, stained, threadbare, faded from too many sunrises. Their names were not recorded in sacred temples or immortalized in song. They lived in mud brick houses, hunched over grinding stones, stirring pots over low fires, drawing water from clay jars as the desert heat curled through the windows like smoke. And yet they lived with a quiet dignity, a rhythm, a kind of invisible grace. Let us imagine one of them, a woman named Tia, not a queen, not a noble, just Tia. She wakes before the first light. The stars still burn faint in the cold pre-dawn sky. The city is silent save for the soft shuffle of other early risers and the distant bray of a donkey tied too close to a wall. Her fingers ache from yesterday, and she knows they will ache tomorrow. Still she rises. There is bread to bake, children to dress, water to haul. Her husband is already gone, working the fields or hauling stones for some tomb that will outlast every name in her family. She lights a small oil lamp and leans over the grindstone, crushing barley into a rough flour. The dust fills her lungs. Her hands move by instinct. She's done this since she was a girl. The same movements, the same weight. Time folds in on itself. There is no sculpture of Tia, no papyrus recording her thoughts, but she was real. You can almost hear her sigh, a sound carried on the wind between the columns of forgotten temples. Her life was not grand, but it was full of labor, of sacrifice, of love where it could grow, and silence where it could not. Sometimes on festival days she'd enter the temple, not as priestess, never that, but as a servant or pilgrim, pressing offerings into the hands of statues so ancient their names were already echoes. And maybe she whispered a prayer for her daughter, or asked the goddess Hathor for protection from the next birth, or simply sat in the cool stone quiet and let herself be still. These temples, they loomed like mountains over the people, carved with tales of pharaohs and gods, but beneath them, in side rooms and hidden corridors, women like Tia swept floors, tended fires, dyed linens. Their labor kept the sacred alive, though they were never called sacred themselves. Their touch was everywhere and their credit nowhere. And still they endured. In Thebes, in Memphis, in Akhetaten, women worked behind closed doors. They sang to their babies in voices no scribe would record. They stitched cloth, picked lice from each other's hair, and whispered stories in the dark. They taught their daughters how to bleed in silence and how to laugh anyway. Even the graffiti scrawled on limestone, messy, unpoetic, hidden in the workers' tombs of Deir el-Medina, offers glimpses of these women. A crude drawing of a woman with her hair unbound, dancing in the moonlight. A scratched love note. A carved name, Setmat's wife, beautiful of voice. Sometimes that's all the past gives us, a voice, a line, a name. But it's enough. Tia may have died young, or lived long and bent-backed, telling stories to children who forgot them before they were old enough to remember her name. But every pot she shaped, every fire she lit, every moment of care she gave in a world that did not care for her, those were acts of defiance, of presence. She didn't rule from a throne, she ruled from the hearth. And when she died, her body might have been wrapped in linen and tucked into a grave marked only by a handful of stones. No gold, no statues, just earth. And the hope that her sons would carry her memory into the next flood season. But we remember her now, and in doing so we pull her from the silence, not to romanticize, not to invent, but simply to see. To hear the soft grind of her stone, to smell the barley dust in the morning, to feel just for a moment what it meant to live in a world where your story was never meant to be told, and tell it anyway. Among the cracked tablets and broken bones of ancient Egypt, there are traces of women who walked between worlds. They were not queens, nor wives, nor mothers in the traditional sense, though they may have worn those titles too. These women bore other names, whispered names, names that didn't pass through public doors but crept like smoke behind them. They were healers, midwives, magic makers. In a world ruled by death and dust, these women held the knowledge of birth and life, and everything in between. Picture a narrow alley in Thebes. It is dark, damp, and quiet, with clay lamps flickering inside reed-framed windows. Inside one of these small homes, a woman kneels beside another. Her hands are stained with herbs, her face marked by time. She is called Sati, a midwife, a keeper of secrets. The birthing woman grips the edges of a low brick stool, sweat pouring down her back. The pain is ancient, eternal. Outside, no one hears her scream. Only Sati does, and she does not flinch. She has heard the sound 1,000 times. She has whispered to babies as they entered this world. She has closed the eyes of mothers who didn't survive the journey. And yet she returns, again and again, with oils and chants and old crumbling recipes passed down like sacred scripture. She knows the secrets of the blue lotus and black cumin. She knows which charms to hang over a crib, and which amulets to place beneath a pillow when the night grows heavy with spirits. She knows when a baby comes feet first, you pray with your whole body. They did not call her a doctor. That name belonged to men, but she had more power than they understood or wanted to, because she worked with the unknown, with blood, with pain, with miracles. And there were others too, women who kept their scrolls hidden, who brewed elixirs from desert plants and whispered to the dead. Not every woman was born into wealth, but some inherited older things, a knowledge older than kings, older than temples, a lineage of bone and breath. They called it Heka, the word for both magic and medicine, because in ancient Egypt there was no line between science and sorcery, no border between a prayer and a prescription. When illness struck, people didn't just reach for a salve, they reached for spells, for gods, for women like Neferu, who could mix a healing paste and recite the 72 names of the divine, all in the same breath. She'd write incantations on linen and wrap them around fevered limbs. She'd grind lapis lazuli into powders and smear them on a child's brow. She believed, and perhaps it was true, that sickness was not just of the body, but of the soul, and that sometimes the cure was not a balm, but a word. And yet, this power came at a price, to hold knowledge in a world that feared it was dangerous. Women who healed could be respected, or suspected, sometimes both. Depended on the outcome, on the mood of the gods, on the whims of men. If a baby lived, you were a miracle worker. If it died, you were a curse. If a noble recovered from a fever, your herbs were blessed. But if he worsened, you were called something else. Whispers turned to warnings. Herbalists became witches. Midwives became monsters. Women who spoke with too much certainty were accused of sorcery, or seduction, or worse. And so many walked a knife's edge. Revered, needed, yet never safe. They wore their knowledge like armor, and sometimes like a wound. We will never know all their names. The temples did not record them. The tombs did not preserve their stories. But every unearthed amulet, every faded spell on papyrus, every worn fertility figurine, speaks of their presence. Their fingerprints are still pressed into the clay bowls used to mix potions. Their breath still clings to the reeds that once made flutes to calm the laboring. They were never meant to be remembered, but memory, like magic, has a way of surviving. So tonight we remember them. The women who delivered life, who held back death, who walked alone in the quiet hours when the veil between worlds grew thin. They may not have worn crowns, but they ruled over something far more mysterious. The fragile edge between this world and the next. And in their silence, they still speak. Not with words, but with the echo of footsteps in the sand. The flicker of a flame in the dark, and the heartbeat of a newborn child, crying out under the ancient stars. The pyramids were not built by gods. They were not conjured from the sand or carved by divine hands. They rose from sweat, from calloused fingers, from broken backs and silent mouths. And among those voices erased from stone and story were women. Not queens, not priestesses, but laborers, servants, daughters of the dust. History rarely pictures them, yet their shadows stretch through the mortar. We imagine ancient Egypt as a realm of male grandeur. Pharaohs in gold, priests with staffs, architects sketching under the burning sun. But behind every monument, every engraved wall, every alabaster statue, there was the unseen labor of women. The village of Deir el-Medina, nestled in the cliffs west of Thebes, artisans and builders lived in tight, sun-bleached homes. The men chiseled tombs for kings. The women kept the village alive. They hauled water, ground grain, spun flax into linen, raised children, nursed the dying. No hieroglyph honors them. But without their hands, even the Valley of the Kings would have crumbled. Their labor was quiet and but constant. Imagine a woman named Aset. Not a noble, not a scribe, just a wife, a mother, a potter's daughter. She rises before the sun, slips a reed mat from her sleeping child, and starts her day in silence. Her fingers are stained from ochre, crushed to paint coffins. Her eyes burn from the kiln smoke. She's weaving linen for burial shrouds. She's boiling pitch to seal jars of honey, to feed the dead in the afterlife. And sometimes at night she slips into the tomb her husband carves, not to admire it, but to clean the dust, smooth the plaster, mix the pigment. She will never be remembered for this. But the colors on those sacred walls, they are hers. Aset is not alone. Across Egypt, women filled the workshops of the gods. They embroidered temple curtains, shaped perfume from myrrh and date oil. They brewed beer, not for feasting, but for offerings, for ritual, for memory. Even in death their work remained, eternal, though unnamed. But not all were free. In the cool stone corridors of temple estates, women toiled as bonded servants. Debt slaves, war captives, and the poor forced into labor. They swept courtyards with bare feet, polished bronze, cooked for priests who would never speak their names. They lived in silence, in obedience. And when they died, they vanished, their bones unmarked, their stories unspoken. But if you close your eyes, you can feel them still, moving through the shadows of Karnak, kneeling in the gardens of Luxor, scrubbing the white sandstone floors with hands that bled. They were not powerless, but they were invisible. And even those with status knew what it meant to serve. In the royal court, even noble women were assigned roles in the household of the pharaoh. Not as guests, but as attendants. Decorated, yes, but kept. They learned to play music, to pour wine, to smile in silence while powerful men passed judgment like gods. You see, in Egypt, women were both sacred and bound. The goddess Isis was revered, the divine mother, healer, protector. Her image was etched into temple walls, her name whispered in childbirth, her magic invoked by kings. But for every woman called divine, 1,000 were treated as dust. Their names did not survive the centuries, but their work, their presence lives on in what remains. Not in the stories carved into monuments, but in the things no one notices. The smooth corner of a burial chest sanded by hand, the woven sandals placed beside a mummy's feet, the faint scent of cardamom and coriander still lingering in ancient jars, the careful threads in the linen wrapped around a dead man's chest stitched, perhaps by a woman who never knew his name. She was not remembered, but she remembered. She worked, she endured, and the kingdom endured because of her. These were not women of legend. They were women of salt and sun, of silence and strength, of dust under their nails and centuries pressed against their shoulders. And tonight, under the same stars that watched them toil, we remember them, not with monuments, but with memory, with breath, with reverence. Because sometimes, the greatest stories are the ones buried deepest, and the hands that shaped a kingdom were never carved into stone. Now close your eyes for a moment, and imagine the hush of twilight over the Nile. The river runs slow and silent, like a breath held between worlds. Shadows lengthen, birds retreat to their hidden roosts. The fields are quiet. Only the soft clink of pottery, the low rustle of linen, the whisper of sandals on stone. This is the hour when the living prepare for night, and when the dead begin to stir in memory. Because in Egypt, death was never the end. It was a passage, a continuation, a door flung open into the eternity of the Duat, the underworld, the hidden realm of Osiris. And guiding the soul across that sacred threshold were women. Not in flesh, perhaps, but in form, in ritual, in story. The feminine was woven into every inch of the afterlife. From the cool, sacred oils poured on the brow of the dead, to the hymns that called down the protection of sky goddess Nut, spreading her wings across the stars. Yet not all were myth. Some women walked the funerary path with purpose. Mourning women, professional lamenters. Their job was to weep for the dead, to scream their pain into the desert wind, to claw their faces and tear their hair in ritual grief. They were the voice of sorrow, hired to cry when others could not, or would not. To the modern ear, it may seem strange, theatrical perhaps, but in Egypt, grief had structure. It had form. Mourning was an offering, a way to escort the soul from breath to silence. And who better to guide that passage than a woman? Imagine the scene. A narrow village courtyard at dawn, the body laid out, wrapped in linen, face uncovered. Two women kneel at the head, painted with black coal that runs down their cheeks like ink. They chant low prayers. Their voices crack with practiced pain. They are not family, but they carry the weight of 100 funerals in their throats. Their names are lost, but their sound was sacred, and they were not alone. In the temples of Thebes and Abydos, chantresses of Amun, women trained in sacred music, lifted their voices to the gods. These were not ordinary women. They were literate, often noble-born, selected for purity and devotion. Their role, to perform rituals, play the sistrum, and invoke the divine presence through sound. They were vessels of divinity, priestesses in all but name. And though they did not wield the political power of high priests, their influence was spiritual, eternal. Without their voices, the rituals were incomplete. Without their presence, the gods would not be pleased. It was not common, not easy, but it was real. In a world ruled by men, these women found power in the margins. Some carved their names into history, most did not. Yet still they sang. Still they mourned. Still they whispered into the ears of gods. And behind closed doors within the walls of common homes, there was another kind of sacred rite. One not performed in temples, but kitchens. Not with incense, but with grain and milk and blood. Motherhood may seem mundane, but in ancient Egypt, childbirth was a divine hazard. A sacred gamble, a brush with death. No antiseptics, no pain relief. Just the steady hands of midwives, the sharp edge of risk, and the prayers of frightened mothers. Women labored crouching on birthing bricks, supported by other women, midwives, sisters, aunts. They burned amulets, muttered incantations to Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, and Bez, the squat, lion-faced dwarf protector of homes and children. They drew protective symbols on the walls, sprinkled salt at the door, covered mirrors, because they knew what could come. They had seen it. Stillborn infants. Mothers gone pale and cold, blood that would not stop. Silence where a cry should be. And yet they birthed anyway, again and again. Because birth was not only life, and it was duty. It was hope, it was survival. A woman who bore children, especially sons, was valued, protected. A widow with many offspring had a better chance of survival. A barren wife, disgraced, cast aside, or worse, replaced. So the stakes were not just emotional, they were existential. And once the child was born, the work only deepened. A mother became the guardian of memory, the keeper of family lines, the instructor of gods, myths, manners. She fed, bathed, clothed, taught. She protected against both real illness and supernatural threats, curses, demons, wandering spirits. She held the home together with hands scarred by effort. She carried Egypt in her arms. But she did not ask for glory. She did not wait for her name to be inscribed on a stele, because she knew no one was coming to remember her. So she remembered herself. In the folds of linen she washed, the bread she baked, the songs she hummed to sleeping children. She became history not by choice, but by necessity. Tonight, as you listen, feel her in the silence, in the spaces between words, in the hush of a world long gone. Because even now her breath moves through these stories like wind through reeds. And though history did not write her name in gold, she wrote herself into eternity, with love and labor and lullabies. Of course, here is part 7 of your slow, cinematic, historical documentary, continuing the soft, whispered descent into the hidden world of women in ancient Egypt. Let the tone remain hushed, poetic, and emotionally heavy, like a memory unfolding beneath candlelight. There's something sacred about silence, isn't there? Not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that feels full of breath, full of waiting, like a moment just before rain or just after a story ends. And Egypt was full of that kind of silence, not just in tombs and temples, but in kitchens, behind woven veils, in the glances passed between women kneeling by a grinding stone or drawing water from the river. That unspoken understanding, a language of nods and quiet eyes. Because where words failed, endurance spoke, and few endured more than the women who served within the palaces of pharaohs, royal concubines, handmaidens, and harem wives, bound to lives of unimaginable comfort and quiet torment. Now when you hear harem, your mind might reach for some distant fantasy. Silks, luxury, dancing girls in candlelit halls. But in Egypt, the Per Kenner, the house of the royal women, was far less romantic. It was a prison of polished limestone. The harem was more than a place for Pharaoh's pleasure. It was a political tool, a repository of alliances, where noble families sent their daughters to secure influence through bloodlines. Some of these girls were children, 10, 11, 12, torn from their homes, painted with sacred oils, taught to walk, speak, and breathe like shadows. Most would never meet the pharaoh. They lived their days behind closed walls, embroidering, rehearsing music, offering prayers. Their world was gardens and guards, perfumed corridors lined with columns, and the quiet ache of uncertainty. Would they be chosen? Would they be remembered? Or would they age behind those walls, nameless, childless, a footnote in no one's scroll? And for those who were chosen, the stakes only grew sharper. A pharaoh's favor was fleeting. Beauty withered. Envy bloomed like mold in the corners. Political rivalries among women could be just as deadly as battles among men. Poison was not unknown. Whispers could carry a woman from royal bed to execution block. Even bearing a son, the highest prize, was no guarantee of safety. Because a son meant power, and power meant threat. And in the world of dynasties, a child could be a weapon as much as a legacy. So these women survived not by strength, but by silence. By patience, by the ability to disappear into stillness, like a feather landing on water. But not all women accepted that fate. Some dared to step out of the harem's hush and into the burning light of politics. One such woman was Tia, wife of Amenhotep III. She began as a commoner, not a princess, not a noble-born girl of foreign blood, just the daughter of a chariot commander. But she possessed something rarer than birthright. Intellect, charm, and the uncanny ability to make herself indispensable. She didn't rule from the shadows. She wrote letters to kings, sat beside Amenhotep in official ceremonies, appeared on monuments, equal in height, equal in gaze. Foreign dignitaries addressed her by name. She was not an ornament. She was power itself, veiled in grace, crowned in intelligence. And yet even Tia, with all her influence, could not rewrite the rules entirely. When her son, Akhenaten, took the throne and launched one of the strangest religious revolutions in Egyptian history, she watched from the sidelines. He banished the old gods, abandoned the temples, built a new capital, Amarna, dedicated to Aten, the sun disk, a god without face or form. And Tai vanished into history's fog. We don't know how she felt, if she agreed, if she wept, if she whispered warnings he refused to hear. The records go silent. The sand covers her footprints. And yet, she remains. Not in fact, but in feeling. Like so many women of her time, and ours, her legacy is not in the papyrus, but in the space between the lines. In what is missing, what was never written, but always felt. So tonight, as you lie in the hush of your own room, let your thoughts drift toward those silent walls, the gardens of the harem, the halls of power, the courtyards where music echoed and futures unraveled. Let yourself imagine what it meant to survive in stillness, to scheme in shadows, to mother kings and bury them. Let the silence speak. Because sometimes, silence is the only thing that tells the truth. The Nile moves slowly at night. Its waters, dark and wide, glide like liquid obsidian beneath the stars. Along its banks the world quiets. Palms sway in the warm hush. Crickets hum. Somewhere far off a reed flute plays a song no one remembers learning. The kind passed from mother to daughter, like a lullaby soaked in dust. And in that quiet, a new figure begins to emerge. Not a queen, not a concubine, a priestess. Or rather, what a priestess could have been if only the gates had been left open. You see, ancient Egypt was a land ruled by gods as much as kings. Every breath, every harvest, every death was tied to ritual. The temples were the beating hearts of civilization, places where order, or ma'at, was renewed daily, where gods were fed, clothed, sung to, where the sun rose each day not because of physics, but because someone lit incense and whispered the sacred names. And yet, for all this sacredness, for all this devotion to harmony and divine balance, women were largely locked out of the temple's core. They could not be scribes who recorded the rituals. They could not be high priests who touched the sacred statues. They could not recite the complex spells that carried the soul safely through the underworld. Only rarely, exceptionally, would a woman be allowed to ascend to spiritual prominence. And even then, she was often a figurehead, an ornament. Her power was borrowed, held at the pleasure of a male pharaoh. Still, the yearning was there, in quiet corners, in whispered prayers. Imagine her, a young girl with eyes like dark amber, watching from behind the columns as her brother is taught to write, while she grinds pigment for his ink. She listens. She learns in silence. Her mind fills with the sacred words even if her lips are forbidden to speak them. She memorizes the stars by watching her father consult the heavens. She learns which oils are offered to which gods, how the lotus must be placed just so beside the image of Hathor, how the hymns must be sung, low and breathless, just above a whisper. Knowledge was not given to her. She stole it piece by piece from the edges of rooms she was never meant to enter. And though the scrolls will never bear her name, though the temple doors remained closed, there is something eternal about her defiance. There were exceptions, yes. In Thebes during the 21st dynasty, one title flickers through history like a torch in fog. God's wife of Amun. It sounds delicate, ceremonial, but this role, when it was given in full force, well, made a woman perhaps the most powerful person in Egypt. She controlled temple wealth, she managed land, she could appoint high priests. At times she rivaled Pharaoh himself, but this came centuries after the golden age of the Great Pyramids. And even then, her position depended on royal favor, inherited more like property than power. So for most women, their faith remained private, deeply felt but rarely recognized. They built little shrines in their homes, left food for their ancestors, sang to Hathor, goddess of music and love, prayed to Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, when their bellies grew round with life and fear. Because childbirth was a ritual too, one steeped in danger. Imagine the scene, a cramped room, thick with incense and sweat. Women gather, midwives murmur spells. The mother clutches a birth brick, clay painted with protective deities. No anesthesia, no sterile tools, just blood, breath, prayer. And if she survived, she would thank the gods. Offer milk, bury the umbilical cord beneath the threshold. But if she didn't, well, the gods were just, but they were never gentle. And so faith for these women was not just devotion. It was survival. They prayed not for glory, but for mercy. Not for power, but for peace. To live another day, to keep their children safe, to endure. In this way, every Egyptian woman, from the palace to the peasant's hut, became a quiet priestess of her own world, tending to altars made of clay and love, whispering sacred names in the dark, keeping the old gods alive, not with gold, but with grief. So as you lie there now, wrapped in your own silence, think of them, of fingers stained with ochre, of prayers carried on the backs of wind, of women who never led armies or built tombs, but who held the entire world together. In kitchens, in cradles, in candle-lit corners of rooms no history ever painted. They were not gods, but they were the reason the gods were fed. And that may be the greatest act of worship of all. Let the scene continue, heavy with emotion and shadow. They say the Nile remembers everything. The footsteps of kings, the cries of laborers, the songs of women rocking their infants beneath woven ceilings. All of it, carried by the river, softened, silted, preserved like offerings left too long in the sun. And among these offerings is another truth, a quieter one. Even in death, women bore the weight of the world, but they were rarely honored for it. In the grandeur of Egyptian death, the towering tombs, the jeweled sarcophagi, the sacred rites spoken at midnight, men were immortalized, names etched into stone, faces painted onto linen shrouds with painstaking care, heart weighed against a feather, soul guided through the underworld by Anubis himself. But for the common woman, there was often no tomb, no gold, no spells from the Book of the Dead, only a shallow grave, a handful of amulets, and silence. Think of that, a life of sacrifice, of childbirth, of tending fires and wounds and broken men, only to be buried in the dust, nameless, forgotten. But the elite women, those who brushed shoulders with divinity, they were afforded more, still bound by the limits of the age, but given a path, however narrow, into eternity. The preparation for their death was not a moment, it was a lifetime. It began with their jewelry, not merely decoration but protection. Scarabs, Ankh's Eye of Horus, each piece inscribed with power, designed to ward off evil both in this world and the next. A necklace might be set with turquoise for rebirth, or carnelian for blood and vitality. Bangles jingled softly with every movement, a kind of ritual music meant to keep the soul awake, alert. Perfume was sacred, not for beauty, though beauty mattered always, but for sanctity. Myrrh and frankincense to purify the body, lotus oil to anoint the skin. The scent of eternity sealed into every pore. And when the end finally came, death itself was treated like a wedding. The body was wrapped in layers of linen, each fold a whisper, the face painted to resemble life. Not a corpse, but a dream of what life might look like if the soul could smile. But this process, sacred and meticulous, cost silver, and silver was not easily earned. So for every noblewoman prepared in the sacred halls of embalmers, countless others were left to the winds, buried by family in the outskirts of villages, given only the prayers whispered by their children, returned not to eternity, but to earth. Still, they hoped, because even the poorest woman might leave behind one thing the priests couldn't take away. Her story, inscribed in symbols, etched into pottery, hidden in letters on scraps of papyrus, buried beneath rubble, found centuries later in forgotten rooms, a woman's shopping list, a lullaby, a note to a daughter warning her to marry wisely. These were not epics, they were not tales of conquest or divine birth, but they were real. And that is why they matter. Because in the end, history does not survive in the monuments of kings. It survives in the breath of those who whispered, not shouted, who endured, not conquered, who lived quietly and left behind echoes. Even Cleopatra, the most famous woman of Egypt draped in myth and marble, was not merely a seductress or a political pawn. She was a mother, a linguist, a strategist, a woman navigating the ruins of an empire with nothing but her wit and her will. But the world does not remember the complexity of women easily. It carves them into masks, smooths away their rough edges and rewrites their truths into palatable legends. It forgets that queens bleed, that goddesses grieve, that even the most powerful women of ancient Egypt were still trapped, not by their bodies, but by the stories told about them. So tonight, let us remember not the myths, but the women themselves. Not as symbols, but as souls. A baker's wife in Thebes, mourning her fifth stillborn child beneath a blood-red sunset. A grandmother in Memphis teaching her granddaughter how to weave papyrus into sandals. A midwife who has seen too many mothers die and no longer believes the gods are watching. Queen pacing the palace halls, aware that her legacy will be written by men who never knew her name. These were the real women of Egypt. Flesh, bone, breath. Forgotten, yes, but only because history closed its eyes. Now, open yours and see them, but let the journey deepen. By now, you may feel it. That stillness that only ancient stories bring. A quiet ache like the hush before a storm, or the way old ruins seem to breathe beneath the dust. Let it in. Because we are not finished. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The rustling of linen robes, the low chant of temple priests, the sobs of a girl kneeling beside an altar, her forehead pressed to cool stone, whispering a name no one will remember. She is praying for a future, or perhaps for forgiveness. But in Egypt, prayers were often drowned out by hierarchies older than the pyramids themselves. The great temples of Amun and Ra, vast glittering monuments rising like stone suns into the desert air, were not open sanctuaries. They were fortresses, gateways to the divine, yes, but policed by status, ritual, and bloodline. And for women, they were mostly closed. Despite the myths, despite Isis, Hathor, Bastet, real women in ancient Egypt were rarely allowed behind the sacred curtain. The priesthood was a man's world. Hieroglyphs carved deep into sandstone walls told of male scribes, male astrologers, male keepers of sacred knowledge. Their titles stretched endlessly: he who sees the god, guardian of the hidden name, reader of the sacred flame. But where were the women? They existed, yes, there were exceptions. The god's wife of Amun, a title held by royal women in Thebes, offered a rare glimpse of female religious authority. These were not mere figureheads. They wielded real political and spiritual power, sometimes even controlling entire temple economies. But make no mistake, this was not equality. It was anomaly. Most women could only access the divine through ritual at home, offerings at household altars, small statues of Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth tucked under bed frames, a prayer scratched into a potsherd and buried beneath the threshold. They created their own sacred spaces in secret places, because the official ones had no room for them. Still, they believed. Belief was not a privilege, it was a lifeline. And nowhere was this more apparent than in childbirth. In a world without antiseptics or antibiotics, every labor was a crossing, every birth a gamble. So women turned to magic. Midwives chanted spells between contractions. Amulets were tied around wrists and ankles, not for decoration, but for survival. Spells were scrawled in haste on bowls or beads and worn like shields. In those moments, the divine was not a statue or a distant sun god. It was something primal, bloody, breathing, present. Something that sat beside you in the dark and whispered, "Hold on just a little longer." But even when prayers failed, and they often did, women had to go on. They carried the dead in their arms. They cleaned the blood from the floors. They sang the mourning songs as they wrapped the tiny linen shrouds. And no one recorded their names. There is no book of the dead for them. No grand procession, no golden mask, only silence. And yet, the silence speaks. If you listen closely, it's there. In the fragments of letters found in forgotten courtyards, in the hastily drawn goddess figurines left by doorposts, in the cracked tomb walls where a woman's figure was painted over by a man's. Traces, ghosts, proof that they were here, that they mattered. Not just as vessels, not just as wives or mothers, but as keepers of memory, carriers of magic, survivors of a world that demanded their obedience, but was built on their backs. Tonight, remember this. The temples were grand, but they did not feed the children. The priests were powerful, but they did not mend the clothes or sweep the ashes. The pharaohs were gods, but only because women whispered their names into the ears of their sons. So if the past feels male, rigid, silent, golden, that's only because we've been reading it wrong. It was always softer, sadder, stranger. It was filled with women who endured without being seen. But tonight, we see them, and in that seeing, they live again. Some say memory fades like smoke, but Egypt doesn't forget. It keeps everything, even the whispers. If you've ever stood near the walls of Deir el-Medina, the village of the workers who built the tombs of kings, you know what I mean. The air is heavy there, as if every breath is full of stories not yet spoken, as if the desert itself is waiting to exhale. This was a village carved into stone and sweat, home to some of the most skilled artisans of the ancient world. Painters, masons, draftsmen, foremen, men whose hands shaped eternity. But behind the men were women, always. Women who bore the burden of survival while their husbands vanished into the Valley of the Kings for weeks at a time. Women who nursed the children, mended the linen, carried water under the weight of sun that felt like flame. Women who dreamed of gods but worshipped through work. Their homes were small, sun-bleached cubes, with soot on the ceilings and silence in the corners. No grand columns, no golden altars, just jars for grain, a low table, a hearth, and maybe, just maybe, a faded image of Hathor or Isis drawn in charcoal near the door. And still, these walls saw everything. They heard arguments, laughter, prayers, the first cries of babies and the last sighs of the old. One wife, alone too long, writes to her husband who's gone to the tombs. The letter is simple, a clay shard, ink, love etched into dust. Come back soon. The baby misses you. The roof is leaking. Another leaves an offering in a pot outside the village chapel, not for a pharaoh, not for a priest, but for a neighbor lost in childbirth. A few dates, a lock of hair, a coin, grief made into ritual. Deir el-Medina was not a palace, but in its quiet corners the ancient feminine survived. Not in gold, but in resilience. Still, the village had secrets, dark ones. Not all women here were free. Some were slaves, prisoners of war or debt taken from Nubia or Libya or far southern lands. They were bought and sold, passed like tools from one household to another. They had no rights, no names recorded, no voices that survived. But they too left traces. In broken anklets found buried beneath floorboards. In the way their bones were laid to rest, or not. In a chipped bowl, hastily repaired, used not by its owner, but by someone who never had a choice. Can you feel it? The contrast. A village building eternity, while silencing half its soul. Yet even here, in the cracks between brick and scroll, some women broke through the veil of forgetting. There are tomb paintings, rare but real, of wives beside their husbands, not behind them. Arms linked, eyes forward, equal in size and stance. There are names etched into the stone, not as daughters of, not as wives of, but simply as themselves. Shedet mutnofret nani. Not queens, not goddesses, just women, remembered. And that, in a world that tried to erase them, was defiance. Still, most stories did not end with paintings. Most ended with silence. The women of Deir el-Medina, like so many across Egypt, were buried not in splendor but in sand, their graves unmarked, their memories scattered. But tonight, we walk among them. We read their letters. We hear their lullabies in the wind. We feel their presence in the ruins. Not haunting, but watching, waiting, holding the thread of history that was nearly cut. So when you look at the tombs of kings, remember who built them. And when you think of Egypt's greatness, remember who endured it. These women may not have shaped the world in gold and stone, but they carried it, in their arms, on their backs, beneath their hearts. And tonight, we carry them. The story drifts onward. There is a temple that time nearly forgot. Tucked away on the island of Philae, surrounded by the slow, glassy flow of the Nile, it rises like a dream from stone. The Temple of Isis. Long after the last pharaoh fell, long after Rome draped Egypt in its red banners and strange gods, this temple still pulsed with ancient breath. Here, women worshipped. Here, Isis reigned. To the ancient Egyptians, Isis was more than a goddess. She was the divine mother, the mourner, the magician. She stitched her murdered husband Osiris back together from scattered limbs. She breathed life into his corpse with nothing but her tears. She raised her son, Horus, in secret among reeds and ghosts, and when Horus grew strong, he avenged his father and brought justice to the throne. It is no accident that the women of Egypt clung to Isis. In her they saw themselves, guardians of life and death, of memory and sacrifice. And so for centuries they came, wrapped in linen, barefoot on temple stones still warm from the sun. They whispered prayers into the columns, their voices trembling with hopes too fragile for daylight. They came for healing, for fertility, for justice. They came with broken hearts and empty wombs, with jars of honey and strings of dates, with songs only the gods could understand. In the darkened inner chambers, priestesses once moved like shadows, rare, veiled figures in a world that preferred men in white robes. But not here, not always. In the cult of Isis, women found something close to power, Not civic power, not scribal authority, but spiritual presence. They poured libations, they sang the sacred hymns, they interpreted dreams. And in dreams they were equals. But power is never unchallenged. By the time Rome took Egypt in its grip, the worship of Isis had spread far beyond the Nile. Into Italy, Greece, even Britain. She was a goddess the empire couldn't quite contain. And so, they tried to erase her. Temples shuttered, rituals banned, statues defaced, the priestesses scattered like birds startled from a tree. But the river remembered. Even as the temple crumbled, even as water swallowed its base, the stories endured, carved into the stone, whispered through the generations. Isis, the mother of all things, the weaver of worlds. Her presence lingered in silence, and in that silence women continued their quiet resistance. In clay amulets worn beneath robes, in songs passed from grandmother to granddaughter, in little altars tucked behind kitchen jars. Even as Christianity rose, even as the old gods were renamed heresy, the bones of Isis remained, transformed perhaps into the Virgin Mary, into saints and martyrs, but never fully erased. The power of womanhood, divine, resilient, eternal, had found new faces. Still, one wonders, what did it mean truly to stand barefoot before the altar of Isis, to pour oil into a sacred flame, to ask for something as simple as a healthy child, and to wait, to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, the goddess was listening, not for gold, not for power, but for love, for life, and in that fragile request, a truth echoes through time. The women of Egypt, though chained by law, carried a freedom no pharaoh could possess. The freedom to hope, to grieve, to pray. And prayer, after all, is the oldest form of rebellion. Even when the world was stone and silence, they spoke, and so shall we. Of course, let the stillness hold you as we continue. The Nile winds further now, deeper into forgotten alleys of time. Part 13 begins, not with a triumph, but with a whisper. A trace of dust in a shaft of temple light. We are no longer in the courts of queens or the echoes of divine halls. We're in the homes of the unseen. Imagine a single-room mud brick house near the edge of the desert, where the wind never stops brushing against the cracked walls. Inside, a woman kneels beside a grinding stone, her hands coated in fine flour, her knees pressed into hardened earth. She is not royal. She is not remembered. There are no inscriptions bearing her name, no golden mask to preserve her face. But she lived, and she mattered. Her name might have been Merit or Satsubek, or something now lost in the wind. Her life unfolded not in grand rituals, but in repetitions. Draw water, grind grain, knead dough, sweep ash from the hearth, soothe a crying child, offer silence to a husband worn from labor, again and again and again. And this is the rhythm of a life erased by history but written into its very bones. For most women in ancient Egypt, this was the world. Not pyramids but pots, not politics but pulses. The quiet, constant beat of survival. She wore linen, coarse and scratchy, maybe once dyed but now faded. Her fingers were calloused from weaving and carrying, her back bent from years of leaning, lifting, tending. Her jewelry, if she had any, was made of bone or clay, not lapis or gold, but still she wore it, a necklace for beauty, for protection, for hope. She believed in gods but also in bread, in rain that never came, and floods that sometimes came too soon. She believed in omens, in dreams, in the hiss of a snake slipping beneath the door at night. She knew how to tie knots that could ward off spirits, how to mix herbs that could ease a fever, sometimes. She knew how to prepare a body when death came. And death came often. Children were buried behind houses, wrapped in strips of worn cloth, small reed dolls tucked beside them. A son gone to fever, a daughter to the Nile. She wept quietly, then returned to the grinding stone. Because grief did not excuse hunger, and love in her world was an action, measured not in poems or statues, but in the way she held a hand, shared her last fig, folded a blanket just so. No one recorded her story, but her story is the most honest kind we know, a woman who endured. And sometimes she laughed, not because life was kind, but because she was. Because even in a world that offered her little, she made something from it. A lullaby, a loaf, a life. The scribes would not write about her. The priests would not preserve her name in chants. But she belonged to the Nile as much as any king. She was the heartbeat behind every monument, the breath behind every dynasty, the invisible foundation of an eternal land. So tonight, let us remember her, not as an emblem, not as a symbol, but as a soul. Someone who looked at the same stars you do now, and wondered if she would ever be more than dust. And perhaps now she is. Because in speaking her story, in imagining her life, however faint, we breathe her into being once more. And that, too, is a kind of resurrection. Let the hush linger. The desert is quiet now, and the stars hang heavy over the black ribbon of the Nile. We drift deeper into the shadowed corners of ancient memory, into the sacred silence where gods once walked and women knelt with offerings in trembling hands. Part 14 begins here, where belief was not a question but a way of surviving. Imagine a moonless night at the edge of Thebes. The sky, a deep velvet void pulsing with the warmth of fires below. A procession moves slowly across the sand, bare feet whispering against the dust, torches flickering like ghosts. Women lead the way. Their eyes are darkened with kohl, their hair oiled and braided in long black ropes that sway with each step. They are mourners. They sing not for the living, but for the dead. In their arms, wrapped in linen soaked in resin and ritual, lies a body. A woman. Not a queen, not a priestess, just a woman. But tonight, she is the center of a sacred rite. For in death, the body was no longer ordinary. It became a vessel, a bridge between the worlds. And it was women, always women, who carried it across. The ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead is full of spells, instructions, and prayers for navigating the afterlife. But long before a scroll was placed beside the corpse, long before the journey through Duat could begin, it was the hands of women that prepared the dead for what came next. Hands that had cradled life now cradled death. They anointed the body with oils, cedarwood, frankincense, myrrh, each chosen not just for its scent, but for its sacred properties. They whispered prayers over each wound, each scar, each stretch mark, each memory written into skin. They did not flinch from the decay. They honored it. They understood this body had borne life, pain, joy, failure. And now, it was to be remade into something holy. In the embalming tents outside the city walls, the air was thick with the smell of natron and silence. Women wailed, some paid, others grieving from the core of their ribs. They beat their chests, tore at their garments, smeared ashes on their foreheads. Not to perform, but to release. To call the soul back one last time. To tell it was loved, even in absence. Why was it women who always stood closest to death? Was it because they knew its rhythm already? In childbirth? In the blood that visited each month without explanation? In the endless giving of self to others? Was it because they saw endings every day and kept going anyway? Or was it something deeper? A sacred trust between the seen and unseen. The body was wrapped slowly, deliberately. Each layer of linen held a story. Amulets were slipped between folds. A scarab for rebirth, an eye for protection, a knot for strength. The mouth was sealed, the eyes closed with care. And when it was done, the women stepped back. They had done their part. And then they vanished as always into history's blind spot. You see, the rituals of death weren't just for the wealthy. They weren't just ceremonies of grandeur. They were survival, spiritual and emotional. In a world of sudden loss, when disease could sweep away a family in days, the ritual gave meaning to the chaos. It said, this mattered. She mattered. Even if no one remembers her name, even if her tomb was looted or never built, even if all that's left of her is a broken pot, a worn comb, a few threads of linen beneath the sands. Tonight we remember those unnamed women not just as mourners, but as midwives of eternity, carriers of memory, guardians of dignity in a world that often denied them their own. Let their hands not be forgotten. Let their voices echo beneath the stars. For though they moved in silence, they shaped a world. And when we speak of ancient Egypt, we must whisper their names into the void, even if we do not know them, because they are still here, in the dust, in the dark, in the breath between stories. The stars begin to fade now, melting into the soft glow of an ancient Egyptian dawn. A hush settles over the land, as if even time holds its breath. We've walked far together, through dust and ritual, power and silence. And now, as we near the end, there's one more truth to sit with, one more shadow to step into. The myth of equality in ancient Egypt has often been told with a glint of gold and a smile. But women could own property, they say. They could rule as queens. And yes, there were exceptions, radiant and rare. Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come, and Cleopatra, who charmed empires and fell like a star. But exceptions are not the rule, and gold can distract from the bones beneath. Because for every Nefertiti there were 1,000, whose names never made it onto a stone wall or into a scroll. Women who cooked, cleaned, gave birth, bled, buried their dead, served their husbands, and lived entire lives without ever being seen by history. Their voices were not carved in hieroglyphs. Their faces weren't cast in sculpture. They were the silent current beneath the Nile, moving everything, and yet remembered by nothing. And that is the quiet tragedy of it all. They knew their place, not because it was taught in temples or dictated by gods, but because it was woven into every breath of daily life. A woman's world was narrow. Her father's house, her husband's bed, her child's grave. Her value was measured in obedience, in fertility, in her ability to keep the home fire burning even as her own light dimmed. Can you imagine it? The sun rising over a city she'll never leave. A market she'll walk each day, invisible. A tomb she may never enter with dignity. The fear of childbirth every year, the weight of expectations, the loneliness of widowhood. And yet she endures, because that's what they did. They endured, not with fanfare, not with titles, but with strength in the quietest form. And yet, even in that darkness there was rebellion. Sometimes it was as simple as a glance held too long. A private prayer whispered to a goddess instead of a god. A child taught to question. A song hummed that wasn't meant to be heard. These were the quiet revolutions of women who were told they were nothing more than vessels. And yet they carried the world. Look closely enough, and you'll find them everywhere. Etched into broken pottery, faded ink on linen, half-erased names beneath those of men. Pieces of lives that once burned bright in a world that rarely gave them space to shine. They were the ones who spun the thread, who baked the bread, who stitched the shrouds and buried the kings. And though the record keepers forgot them, the earth has not. She holds them still in her dust and stone, in the wind that moves across the desert, in the soft lap of the Nile against its banks. So let us remember them, not just the queens with crowns and painted faces, but the daughters, the midwives, the widows, the weavers, the mourners, the mothers of no one and everyone. Let us say they mattered, even now, thousands of years later, in a world they never could have imagined. We speak their names in silence. We carry their memory through the veil of time. Because history isn't only what's written, it's what's felt. And tonight maybe, just maybe, you felt them too. Thank you for coming with me. If this journey moved you or offered you peace in the quiet hours, I invite you to leave a comment. Tell me how you felt, where you listened from, or simply say goodnight. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let the past lull you to sleep again next time. Until then, dim the lights, rest easy, and remember, even the forgotten leave echoes. Thank you for walking through the dust and echoes with me. If you found comfort in the stillness of this story, if the forgotten whispers of the past helped hush your thoughts tonight, consider leaving a comment. Tell me where you're watching from, or just type, "still listening." I read every single one. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Not for me, but for you, so that whenever the night grows too loud or the world too heavy, you'll always have a quiet corner to return to. And if you'd like to support more calm, more history, and more peace for restless minds, a like or a share is a gentle way to say thank you. Now, Let your screen dim. Let the silence stretch. Let your breath slow and drift. Drift into the spaces where time sleeps and memory lingers. You've been listening to Obscura Historia, and until we meet again, sleep well, dream deep, and remember, even the most forgotten lives once burned with fire.